Shaping Britain's Conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 9 on Wednesday, February the 1st. It's been dubbed Walkout Wednesday. It is believed around 500,000 workers staging the biggest strike in over 10 years across so many of our key sectors, not least, of course, education and rail. It throws up so many points, so many questions. So, hugely obliged to Paul Nowak, who's the General Secretary of the TUC, the Trades Union Congress, a sort of overbody. 5.5 million members. It's a pretty powerful organisation, and he's here to take your calls. Thank you for coming in. Good to have you in, Mr. Nowak. One question before I turn it over to the listeners.
Yep.
In the last week or so, you won't need reminding, the FBU, the Fire Brigade Union, look like they might be moving now. First time, I think, in 20 years to industrial action. Can I put it to you, unless some kind of resolution is brought forward by the government, we might be looking at another day like this in a month or so's time with even more workers involved. What's the reality of that?
Yeah, I think that's a very real prospect, Nick, and it's the last thing that firefighters would want, that paramedics would want, that teachers would want. We want the government to come to the table and talk to us seriously about pay and deliver a fair pay rise for public sector workers. I mean, you've just had the item on about Rishi Sunak's first 100 days. I can tell you one thing he hasn't done in that 100 days is meet me or any other trade union leader.
There's been no meeting between you or any of your senior colleagues and the PM?
There hasn't been one single trade union leader that's met the Prime Minister. Not one single trade union leader has met Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor.
Have you sought a meeting, Mr.
We certainly have. I mean, the first thing I did when I took over this job 3 weeks ago, it feels like 3 years ago, but when I took over this job 3 weeks ago...
Don't tell me you had hair 3 weeks ago, for God's sake, Paul.
I am the only one in my family that does suffer from baldness. That maybe tells you something about the job. But the first thing I did was write to Rishi Sunak and say, we need to sit down and talk about pay. And I haven't had a meeting. Jeremy Hunt, our Chancellor, told the Parliamentary Select Committee at the end of November he would meet with the head of the TUC. He didn't meet my predecessor, Francis. He's not met me. He's not talking to our senior union leaders. And my experience tells you, if you want to resolve a dispute, you've got to sit down and talk. And this is a government that's missing in action, I'm afraid.
So you and your predecessor, Frances O'Grady, sought meetings with both the Chancellor and the PM. They were not forthcoming. Just lastly, before we go to the call then, can I ask you, previous Prime Minister, not Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, do you sense you might have got a meeting? Did Frances O'Grady manage to get meetings with that PM?
Well, you know, we obviously had lots of disagreements with Boris Johnson, but both me and Frances did meet with Boris Johnson, and indeed with Theresa May, his predecessor. And I think, you know, that's the job of government, isn't it? You know, my job as head of the TUC is to deal with who's ever in number 10 Downing Street, Labour, Conservative, regardless of personalities, because my job's to represent working people. And I think when you do represent 5.5-6 million people, I would expect the Prime Minister to, you know, show the courtesy of at least listening to the concerns of those members, concerns of working people more generally.
And it's a very real possibility with firefighters and others. The next one could be even bigger than so-called Walkout Wednesday.
Yeah,
This is not a general strike. Some journalists have been shouting this is anything but a general strike, but it could be bigger.
It's not a general strike. I mean, we've got 48 unions. There are 5 unions taking action today. I think what we're more likely to see is a rolling wave of industrial action. And I think if the government thinks these issues are just going to somehow disappear themselves away, they're absolutely kidding themselves, because our members are facing real terms pay cuts and they want the government to do something about it.
Let's get to the questions. First up is Vivian, who's in Wimbledon, and you're through to Paul Nowak. Vivian, your question. Good morning.
Hi, just a quick one. Sadly, these strikes have impacted me dreadfully. I missed my best friend's funeral. I could not attend, and I've been friends with her since I was 5 years old. I won't say how old I am, because that's not neither here nor there.
That's your prerogative, Vivian. On you go.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't get to my best friend's funeral. I missed my daughter's graduation. That's a milestone moment in my daughter's life and my life, a proud day which I will never get back. And it even got to the point where around Christmas time we were desperately trying to get her home for Christmas, and it nearly came to the point, because of the train strikes and because there was a mess up with coach bookings and things like that with the company. They double booked her coach, so there was no way for her to get back to London. Luckily, thankfully, one of my friends managed to finish work early and go up and get her for us.
Okay.
Are
you impacted today? Are you impacted today?
I am. I've got children at home today, and my daughter, who has gone on back to university to do a PGCE, she's impacted today because she hasn't got a lecture today.
Yeah. If I to move you to your question, then what would you want to ask?
I was just wondering, are you guys aware of the impacts that these strikes are having on people who are trying to do their normal day-to-day jobs? And also, do you think, possibly if it carries on and on, maybe the public support may wane a little?
Let's put that, Paul. Just to remind all callers, of course, Paul Nowak, he's not one of the union leaders who actually calls the strike, whether it's in the rail or the university lecturers, but it is the overarching organisation, the TUC. The leaders, do they realise the pain and suffering sometimes they're causing, particularly Vivian? Paul Nowak.
Yeah. Well, morning, Vivian. Well, listen, first thing I'd say, Vivian, is that nobody likes taking strike action. It doesn't matter whether it's train drivers or it's people working in our schools. It's a difficult decision. People lose pay and they don't get to deliver the services that they're really proud to deliver. And I know your situation, I mean, that's impacted on you personally dreadfully, and that will be the experience of many other people. What I would say, look at rail as an example. Here is a situation where train operating companies are handing out hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends to their shareholders at the same time as expecting their workers to take a real terms pay cut. I don't think that's fair or sustainable. Your daughter's doing a PGCE. I mean, I hope that she goes one day, she qualifies, she goes into our classroom, she becomes a teacher. A third of our teachers leave the profession within 10 years of starting, so that's 250,000 or more teachers in the last 10 years because of workload issues, because of pay. So we've got broken public services, full stop. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're trying to catch a train, book a GP's appointment, wait in A&E, our kids' education. And I think the people who are taking those difficult decisions to take strike action are standing up not just for pay, but for the services they provide.
Come back to Vivian in a moment, but to Vivian's other point, Mr. Nowak, which is if you can't get to your best friend's funeral, if you can't get to your child's graduation, will it start to knock public support for some of your union colleagues?
I don't think it will, Nick, and I'll tell you why, because our members are the public as well. I mean, our railway workers use the NHS, our NHS staff use the trains. We all know, I mean, the people who are taking strike action today will be the friends, the family, the neighbours of the people listening to your show today. And I think when it comes down to public opinion, the frustration should be, rightly, with the government. Why aren't they negotiating? Why aren't they coming up with a solution?
Vivian, a quick response from what you've heard from Mr. Nowak.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, if things aren't great, if pay isn't rising at the same time as inflation and things like that, absolutely, things have to be done. But it's the government, and it's obviously the government. But sometimes
I hear you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a difficult day with your children, I understand, and I'm very sorry you lost your personal friend, and I speak for Mr. Nowak as well, obviously, for your graduation. Vivian, good luck today. I'll let you get back to coping with I think you said your children who aren't at school, and move on. Thanks for your call, Vivian. Robin's in Whitehaven. Robin, go ahead. So good morning.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
Good morning.
It's Paul or Mr. Nowak. On you go with your question. Thank you.
I'm a Labour member, and I'm disappointed that the more front bench Labour MPs and Keir Starmer aren't doing more to support the strikers by way of being on the picket lines. Do you think the leader of the Labour Party, and considering its origins, should be on the picket line supporting workers in this cost of living crisis?
Enough from Sir Keir and his colleagues. Paul Nowak.
Yeah, well, morning, Robin. I mean, the first thing to say is I want politicians across the political spectrum, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Scottish Nationalist, everybody to show support for workers who are taking that difficult decision to take strike action. But, for me, actually the front bench can do more useful things than just stand on picket lines getting selfies. So, for example, this minimum service level legislation effectively will prevent millions of workers potentially taking strike action. Labour have opposed that in the House of Commons. They've promised they'll repeal that legislation if there's a future Labour government. That's the sort of stuff that really matters to me. So, I've been involved. We need as politicians in Parliament standing up for the stuff that really matters to working people. And I think, Keir and the front bench, we're not going to agree on everything, but I think we're headed in the right direction.
Some people have been disciplined, though, as you will be aware, for going on a picket line and then giving unauthorised comments to the media. Indeed, they've lost their post. Do you support that, Paul Nowak?
Well, it's not my job to decide who's on the front bench or not, Nick, in the Labour Party. I mean,
but
as
you're
I say,
happy with Sir Keir's level of engagement?
I want Labour to do two things. First of all, to be an effective opposition. And the polls would suggest that at the moment they are holding the government to affect positively. But I also want them to go into that next election on a manifesto that reflects the stuff that matters to our members. So 0 hours contracts, a ban on fire and rehire. Labour's heading in the right direction. As I say, do I agree with Keir and the Labour Party on every single issue? I'd be an absolute liar if I said I did. But I think we're definitely headed in the right direction. And this promise to repeal the legislation, this attack on the right to strike, I think is really important.
That's featured today. Protect the right to strike.
Yeah.
One newspaper the Daily Mirror, which I think is actually supporting your organisation as well, lays out the importance. Just a quick word on you. Why do you feel that's so important, particularly in light of today's industrial action?
Because at the end of the day, I think we live in a modern democracy, and a hallmark of a democratic society is that democracy is not just about voting in an election every 4 or 5 years. If people have a dispute with their employer, they try and resolve that dispute as effectively as possible. But you have to have, at the end of the day, the right to say, listen, I'm not coming to work, I'm going to go on strike. Now, people have to go through all sorts of legal hurdles in this country to take strike action. It's difficult. But fundamentally, I think the British public support that right to strike. You remove that from people, you might as well say you've got no rights at work at all, no rights that you can enforce. So I think the government, it's being a spiteful piece of legislation because their response to hundreds of thousands of workers taking strike action for the first time is not to listen to their concerns and try and resolve them. It's to ban them from taking strike action.
Before we move on, there's a text here from Ed. Does Paul think a Labour government would meet some or all of the union's demands? Paul Nowak?
I'm not sure in terms of what you mean by demands, Ed, but I mean on pay, I think we'd be having a far more constructive conversation. And as I say, on stuff beyond pay, so a ban on fire and rehire, a ban on 0 hours contracts, union rights to access the workplace, new fair pay agreements in sectors like social care where insecure work and low pay is endemic. I think we'd be in a much better place than the one we are right now.
Robin, thanks for your question. To Mick in Coulsdon. Mick, you're through to Paul Nowak. Go ahead, Mick.
Good morning, guys. I would just like to ask Paul, I'm totally in favour of striking. I just want to ask the question, I think we should have a general strike, everybody. I want to know what he thinks about that.
Paul Nowak.
Morning, Mick. I think there's a couple of issues, Mick. I mean, first of all, as I said before, it's really difficult to take strike action in this country, and I can't just send an email out.
Tell that to the parents whose children aren't there because of the teachers, people who can't get through picket lines at hospitals. Paul Nowak.
If I was a French trade union leader, in order to take people out on strike, I'd write a letter to employers and say, in 48 hours, my members are going out on strike. In this country, you have to have a legitimate trade dispute. You have to give notice to the employer that you're going to take a strike ballot. You have to ballot members by post. Then you have to notify the employer that you're going to take strike action. It's very difficult.
Teachers, I read in France, as you mentioned it, Paul Nowak, teachers must give schools 48 hours notice of walkouts, meaning unions there cannot cause disruption they are trying to impose in Britain, and they have to say whether they're going to be in their classrooms.
Yeah.
Do you support the fact that some NEU teachers, we understand, have not told their bosses or their head teachers whether or not they're at work today? Do you support that?
I do, because we've got a completely different framework of law, Nick, and I'll tell you why I do, because there's a real danger that if individuals identify themselves to the employer that I'm going to be taking strike action, they could be singled out, they could be victimised. This happens, we know, right across the economy. So in France, they literally, all they do is give that 48 hours notice. It takes months for people to take industrial action in this country. But going back to Mick's point about the general strike, there's all sorts of legal and technical reasons why it would be difficult. But fundamentally, we've got millions of workers in the private sector, for example, that we've negotiated fair pay rises for this year. That their employer has said, there's a cost of living crisis, we need to do something to support our staff. Now, we can't ask those staff to take industrial action on pay because they've resolved that issue with their employer. So I get where you're coming from, Mick, and I think my job is not to sort of talk about the grand gesture of the general striker, to say where workers are taking that difficult decision to take strike action, I'll support them as effectively as possible, we'll coordinate it and hopefully make sure that government listens to their voice.
Mick, thank you. On the subject of coordination, Mr Nowak, Dr Mary Bowstead, who I'll just remind my listeners is Joint General Secretary of the Teachers' Union, the one with the industrial action, the NEU, has said the union did not coordinate strike action today with other unions. Are we meant to believe they just magically landed on the same day?
Well, I mean, our unions are always talking to each other, Nick, and you'll know
so
that there are some teaching unions that aren't taking strike action today because they didn't pass those very difficult ballot thresholds I was talking about. I think what we've seen today is 5 unions that have. This was the TUC's Protect the Right to Strike Day. And they've used that date to amplify their voices
and coordinated the action.
Well, I don't think Mary's been on the phone to Mick Wheeler and Aslef and say if we all come out on February 1st, that'd be a great idea. That definitely hasn't happened. But I think workers have seen an opportunity to use today to amplify their voices. And hopefully, and this is the key thing, Nick, to get government to listen to them. And not just listen to them, say, you know what, why don't we do the sensible thing? Let's sit round the table and negotiate. And I go right back to what I said a few minutes ago. I just find it bizarre that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor are missing in action and have refused to sit round the table. How else do they think these things are going to get sorted?
And just finally on that other point, talking about missing in action, we hear from teachers, and I'm sure it's right, that their interests are the pupils and the children that they look after, our most valued possession. and yet you have a teacher who doesn't say last night whether he or she is going to be in class. So her boss doesn't know what we're going to do with 30 pupils because we don't know whether Mr. Nowak or Mr. Ferrari, the form teachers, and you still support that, even with the well-being of the pupils.
I do support that, and I support it because I know that workers will have real worries about being pressurised to come into work, victimised for not coming into work. I know this from other sectors of the economy where employers have tried to turn the screw on people taking their legitimate right to take industrial action. As I say, Nick, I have got a list, literally, I've just tweeted it, a list of 30-odd countries, trade union movements from around the world who've tweeted their support for the right to strike, because the framework of law we've got in this country would make turn people's toes in other countries.
Have you been inconvenienced? Do you mind asking, have you got children who should be at school today, or you don't have children?
I'm in a slightly different situation because my eldest son is actually today my middle son is taking strike action for the first time ever. He's a civil servant.
Oh, right.
My wife works in a university. She'll be taking industrial action.
Yeah.
And but I have been in that situation when my kids were younger where it's been difficult. And I'm not going to hide from the fact that it's difficult, but I do ultimately respect teachers and everybody else having that right to withdraw the labour.
You're going to see your boy on the picket line later?
I think he'd be mortified if I turned up on a picket line, to be honest with you. And he's not in London, so the last thing he needs is Dad turning up, I'm sure.
Right. Let's get another call in. Boys always want to see their dads, I assure you, Paul. John's in Guildford. You're on the radio, John. Good morning. Your question.
I would like to ask, your guest is saying that people don't sit down to negotiate. I would ask, what is the point of negotiation when all the trade unions particularly do is sit there and say no? It is non-negotiable.
Just to clarify, John, in what way do they say
it's non-negotiable to have driver-only trains? What is the point of sitting down with somebody who's going to say no?
OK, this is something very much to do with the RMT dispute that you'll be aware about, and there are concerns by the union as regards passenger safety and well-being, that there should be guards on trains and that driverless trains are dangerous. Others point to services such as South East London, where you had driver-only trains and no guards and whatever it might be. John's saying, if they're going to be that difficult, why sit down? Paul Nowak.
Well, maybe pick up that specific point, John, but then a broader point about sitting down and negotiating. Listen, the government threw in that clause on driver-only operation at the last minute. It wasn't a feature of the negotiations between the RMT and Network Rail or the Rail Delivery Group. The government threw that in because they knew it would scupper a deal. And the reality is, you couldn't even deliver, even if you thought it was a good idea. We haven't got the technology to deploy driver-only operations across the whole of the network now anyway. So it was designed deliberately.
Is that right? They couldn't have done it if they'd wanted to.
Of course you couldn't. I mean, the vast majority of the network doesn't run on driver-only operation. You would have to change things, including the rolling stock, the signalling, the way that people work. I mean, this is not something you could do in 24 hours' time. The broader point on negotiation, I mean, I have to say, John, honestly, I was on the picket line with physiotherapists last week. They've never taken strike action before on pay. Never taken strike action. This is not a militant group of workers by any stretch of the imagination. They are people who are at their end of the tether. And what they can't understand is why the government won't sit down and talk to their unions seriously about pay. And I think that's reflected right across the piece. It doesn't matter whether you're driving a train, working in a school, working in a hospital. The very least people expect is for their employer to give them the respect of sitting down and having a negotiation. That's what I've done all my working life. That's what all of our union leaders have done all their working lives. It's the government, I think, that has forgotten the art of negotiation.
John, thank you. Let's go to the text, tweets and emails. Nick in Nottingham text, given how much the pandemic cost them many billions, including keeping businesses afloat and folk in their jobs, where does Mr. Nowak and his union friends think the money for pay rises should be coming from?
OK, well, it depends on what sector you're talking about. So I said in rail before, we've had private train operating companies, hundreds of millions of pounds dividends. In the public sector, I mean, the TUC will hand in its budget submission today, and we'll be setting out very clearly what we think government could do. So, for example, you could equalise capital gains tax with income tax. That raises alone around about 15 or 16
Wouldn't
billion
every
pounds.
businessman or woman race out of the country at 1,000 miles an hour if they could get it?
No. I mean, Nick, this is constantly put up. I was in Spain a couple of months ago talking to Spanish unions and politicians. They've just introduced a wealth tax for those people who hold more than €3 million. There's a graduated wealth tax. I don't think there's been an exodus of wealthy or successful people from Spain. People see that as a cost of doing business. And politics is all about choices. And this government, let's remind ourselves, a government that's overseeing the lifting of bankers' bonuses at a time when we had a bumper year for bankers' bonuses last year. And I think that people we represent look at that and think, hang about, maybe the choices you're making aren't the ones to support decent public services and decent pay.
Rachel in Bexley, can Paul shed any light on how barristers got what I understand to be a 15% pay rise, says Rachel. Is that correct? Did they settle for 15?
I'm not sure, because we don't represent the barristers and they're not part of the
But there was
TUC.
industrial action, of course.
There was, and I think actually, I mean, they've had a similar set of issues to other public sector workers, which is, this pay squeeze wasn't just this year. If it would have been just this year, then people might have been able to sort of put up with it, but it's been 10 years in the making. And, we published research today, Nick, that showed the average public sector worker in real terms is over £200 a month worse off than they were in 2010, which is unprecedented. This has never happened in our economic history before, that living standards don't go up.
Let's get back to the calls. Brad in Bexley as well. Brad, you're on the radio. Your question to Paul Nowak.
Yeah, hi. So thinking about the current situation, it seems like one of the major problems is that all the different sectors are asking for inflation-busting pay rises. Now, clearly, that's a bit difficult because we're not growing. The economy is not growing at 10% or whatever the inflation rate is. So the question is there some way we can prioritize? Because in my experience, some sectors are striking for the first time, like you were just saying, and then there are other sectors who seem to be continually striking and getting better terms every time. So is there a way we can prioritize and say that these are the sectors we prioritize just for this time?
Let's put that. I mean, it's one of those things I think that sort of makes sense on paper, but you'd need the wisdom of Solomon to actually... Yeah. I wouldn't want to put it into place, but I'm not the leader of the TUC. Paul Nowak.
Hiya, Brad. Morning. I mean, first of all, just to say, Brad, there's absolutely no evidence at all that it's wages that are driving inflation in this country. It's not the pay of supermarket workers or NHS workers or care workers or train drivers or anyone else that's driving inflation. Don't take my word for it. Rishi Sunak, when he was our Chancellor, said that was the case. I mean, we've got a particular set of pressures on inflation, mainly driven by energy prices and the war in Ukraine and so on. But I'm not really interested in sort of trying to identify who's deserving of a decent pay rise and who isn't. I mean, I want everybody to get a fair shout on pay. So last week we saw, for the first time ever again in this country, Amazon workers taking strike action in Coventry. People on £10...
Sorry, are they part of a union that's...
Yeah. £10.50 an hour, subject to a whole range of sort of intrusive monitoring and surveillance in a
Even when they want a toilet break, I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they've got a stronger case as our nurses and paramedics, as our teachers. And so, I wish it was the case that we were in some sort of wage price spiral and we had to do something about it. The reality is our wages are falling behind year on year. And I say, if it was 1 year... people might be able to say, I can live with it 1 year. But when it comes year on year and you see your bills going up all the time and everything else going up apart from your pay, then people just think it's not sustainable.
Brad, thank you. Susan in Harpenden. Susan, your question to Paul Nowak. Go ahead.
I just want to know how Mr. Nowak can justify when, after having listened to you this morning with all your figures and facts about the teachers in Europe earning less, working more hours. So how can you justify this teacher strike?
Stay on the line. Mr. Nowak might not be aware of this. This is research that's been published in one of the newspapers today from the OECD, which actually shows that as regards teachers' pay in developed countries, it's England and Scotland, they don't have the UK, are in 6th and 7th position, earning considerably more than countries such as Spain, Japan, the OECD average and the EU average. This is for a teacher who's done 15 years. He or she has done 15 years, both at primary and secondary level. I'm very happy to let you have a look at the tables. You might be aware of them.
Yeah, I haven't seen that particular report, Nick. But what I would say to you is, well, first of all, you've got to get to 15 years. And as I said to you before, a third of teachers leave the profession within 10 years because of workload issues, because of pay. And there is.
I'm sure teachers in Spain is under a lot of stress as well.
Well, I'm sure that they are. I'm sure that they are, and I obviously don't represent teachers in Spain, so it's hard to draw a direct
when you look at
comparison.
That table and you see there's England and Scotland, we don't have figures, 6th and 7th, I think, respectively, developed nations, and the charts there showing that they're making, in some instances, considerably more. What does that do for their argument about pay?
Well, this is... I'd need to look at these figures in more detail. I mean, first of all, it talks about the hours that people are expected to be available. I know plenty of teachers, and the hours that they work in the classroom are not the full extent of their working hours. They're taking work home. They're doing work in the holidays. So I'd need to look at these figures in more detail. All I do know is, in real terms, teachers' pay is falling. if they don't see a bump in the pay this year, they'll have had an effective 5-6% pay cut. And if we're serious about education, you've got to be serious about investing in teachers and the teacher workforce.
They are serious, Mr. Nowak. Again, look at those tables. They're earning more than virtually every other developed country. This is the OECD.
Not fair to every developed country, Nick. I mean, I'm looking at the table.
Yeah.
Well, so it still puts us behind Luxembourg, Germany, the Netherlands, the US, Denmark. I mean, there's lots of countries that we are behind.
They make it sound so parlous. Is it true when we look at figures such as that?
Well, I think teachers are voting with their feet. They're voting with their feet, and I don't think they're doing it lightly. And I think we should all be concerned when we have people leaving a profession that we know is going to be essential to the future of our, the success of our nation and going forward, the education of our kids. They're voting with their feet. So, if you're a teacher in Liverpool or Leeds or London, you're not really interested in how does my pay compare to a teacher in Germany, the Netherlands or Japan. What you're interested in is what you take home every single month, and if it's going down in real terms, that's a problem.
Last couple of minutes together. Just stay, you won't be surprised, Mr. Nowak, it is teachers that's getting a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Chris in Kent. How can teachers and even Paul Nowak expect to keep credibility? They're putting their own pay above their future for children, and this is a cohort of young people who've had to endure COVID and some year have not had the right level of tuition, and some university students have hardly seen their lecturers face to face. Quite a long question. Paul Nowak.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there's this sort of false distinction being drawn between the paying conditions of our teachers and the experience of education, because at the end of the day, we need well-rewarded, professionally sort of satisfied teachers to be able to deliver the quality of education that we want. And I wish that I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of it.
That was Chris in Kent.
Yeah,
Chris in Kent.
This government notoriously didn't provide the funding that their own advisors said they needed to provide to make up that backlog in kids' education that we all went through because of the pandemic. So, to turn fire on teachers who day in, day out are doing their best to sort of teach our kids, I think that's the wrong target. Think about education in the round. Think about the pressures our schools are under. Think about what we can all do to make education better, rather than single out teachers who want a decent pay rise.
And finally, again to the texts and tweets and emails, this is Guy in Winchester who says, we've talked about there being an ambulance staff strike, there could be firefighter strike. What of the police? Should police officers be able to take some form of industrial action? Paul Nowak. We've got every other emergency service showing their dissatisfaction.
I'm going to handily duck this question because the Police Federation, by law, are not allowed to affiliate to the TUC. I think it goes back to the 1912 police strike.
Be reviewed?
I might have my labour history wrong. I can't speak on behalf of the Police Federation.
Should that be reviewed?
I think there are countries around the world where police officers can take forms of industrial action, and I support all workers being able to take industrial action. Is it top of my list of priorities, Nick? To be honest with you, I'm more concerned about protecting the rights that we've got now.
But what then of minimum service? If, understandably, you think that if police officers have their own cause, and of course we know ambulance crews, we know firefighters, we do need a guaranteed level of minimum service, do we not, for our own safety?
Let me give you a real-world example that does really concern me. Our prison officers, for example. In Scotland, prison officers do have the right to take industrial action. They don't have that right in England. I don't think that prison officers in Scotland have used that right irresponsibly. They would always be concerned about making sure that prisoners are still safe, that they're keeping the community safe. I think if it's good for prison officers in Scotland, it's good for prison officers in England as well.
And firefighters and everyone, you're satisfied we don't need a minimum service guarantee or law or diktat to provide that firemen and women turn out, that ambulance crews turn out?
No. And again, I'll give you the practical examples, Nick. I stood on the picket lines with those paramedics. These are people who day in, day out serve the public of London and other cities. The idea that they would leave people in life-threatening situations. I mean, I was there on the picket lines where the ambulances were going out and they were being very clear, we need to go to this call, we got somebody in distress. I wish that the government put as much focus on minimum service levels at times when there wasn't industrial action. We've got a crisis in our ambulance service. It's not a crisis of industrial action. It's a crisis of leadership from our government and investment in the NHS.
And later today you have something planned. I think you're headed eventually to Downing Street. Just in a sentence or two, tell the listeners what you're hoping to effect today.
Well, I'm hoping the government will listen to us, that they'll pull back their attacks on the right to strike, that they'll deliver a pay rise for public sector workers. And at the end of the day, I'm going in there with 250,000 signatures to Downing Street. There are 500,000 people taking industrial action today. There'll be people at 80 events up and down the country. Let's hope the government listens to us.
Grateful for your time. Thanks for appearing here. Paul
Thank
Nowak,
you.
who's of course the General Secretary of the TUC, appearing on LBC 9:32 News Headlines.
The leader of the trades union Congress, Paul Nowak, has told LBC workers across the country are using today to amplify their voices. The TUC estimates 500,000 people are taking part in industrial action. They include teachers, train drivers and civil servants in disputes over pay and conditions. An investigation has started into claims firefighters took photos from the